from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's coming up. Out of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Jim Robb will offer this week's cattle market insight. Among other topics, Jim will look ahead to the USDA's Cattle on Feed report coming out this Friday. Also, K-State's Glynn Tonsor and Mykel Taylor will talk about some of the futures market issues that were addressed at an agricultural futures conference, co-sponsored by K-State and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. They say this conference shined a light on a number of key commodity futures trading topics currently. And Jeff Wickman checks in later with this week's 4-H segment. He'll talk with K-State's Deryl Waldren about the concept behind the Northwest Kansas 4-H day camps. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along on this Monday. For starters, our weekly look at the cattle market trends, and we brought by via phone Jim Robb, the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center in Denver. As you know, that is a project co-sponsored by K-State and numerous other land-grant universities. Well, Jim, it's a pleasure to talk about an uptick in the fed cattle market from last week after several weeks of slumping prices. Maybe a corner has been turned here?
Well, we certainly had stabilization, and we had stronger fed cattle prices last week. At the end of the week, we had trades over 120 on the live steer basis, and that's up solidly from the prior week and still running below a year ago, Eric. We're down about 6% year over year on the fed cattle market, but given how the futures have been pointing, et cetera, that's a bit of a pleasant surprise. The futures have been pointing to strongly lower market on the live cattle contracts. Calf markets also were stronger across most of the United States, a few pockets of weaker prices, but we were up solidly last week, or flat with the prior week, and we're up about 3 to 5% from a year ago on the calf and yearling prices. That's a bit of a strengthening that is probably a little bit supported by the fed cattle market and getting closer, at least in some of the United States, where we have some pasture potential to turning out on summer grazing conditions.
To what do you attribute largely that bounce back in fed cattle prices last week? Was it overdue for a correction, this market? What?
Probably a little bit overdue for a correction. The box beef cutout value, though, was weaker, down about 2% for the week, and just barely above a year ago. So it's not the meat market as much. Packer margins are positive. But clearly, as we've gotten closer to mid-month, the packers have needed a few more cattle, and at the end of the week, they started to show their cards. So they're trying to fill their, often at this time of year, we have a mid-month rally in the fed cattle market, and that seems to be what we're stepping into right now as they transition, the packers do, from their program cattle, in quotes, to buying more cattle on the negotiated marketplace. And then also, we've had interest in selling cattle, so these two have come together to get some pretty good movement on the cattle side that should carry over into the next week.
Jim, want to talk a bit about some numbers that the USDA released last week, the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. Those are monthly forecasts by the department. The adjustments made in that report, what caught your attention, if anything, there?
Well, the adjustments were rather minor. I think to come in line with the prospective plantings report, from a crop perspective, the feedstuff prices were pushed higher as we look at year-to-year declines in acreage, especially of corn. That's important for the livestock sector to reflect that we are getting some higher feedstuff costs. And then on the meat market side, the adjustments were rather minor, less than 1%, so some people have tried to make news out of that, but those were really in line with expectations. I think that A bit of the key to the report from a broad picture livestock perspective were the trade numbers from USDA. We've had a lot of geopolitical concern and with tariffs, et cetera, and USDA actually made very small changes. And even in the beef complex, we've been concerned about tariffs, especially on pork to China. And USDA lowered the expectations by about 25 million pounds on their forecast for the balance of this calendar year, pork exports to China. But they also raised exports to some other countries. So that's kind of good news that the whole geopolitical and the tariffs and all that scenario, at least at this point in time, is causing rather minor changes in forecast to U.S. pork and beef exports.
Now, one hopes that the other shoe won't drop here soon, and these tariff worries truly manifest themselves into lower prices. But right now, the market seems to be pausing and waiting to see what develops.
Waiting to see what develops, and again, the forecasts on exports are probably not quite as gloom and doom as maybe some of the speculation has been.
And before we leave that WASDE report, and you hinted at this, the feedstuff concerns with corn acreage potentially down, and that would normally suggest that prices would be higher. But you don't think that cattle producers need to get too excited about advanced pricing feed needs at this juncture?
At this juncture, but we are, quickly getting to corn planting season. Much of the upper Midwest still has not even prepared their fields for corn planting. So we're starting to get a little bit precarious on a timely planting. So it's certainly something to watch as we move ahead. And I think on a year-over-year basis, we're going to be paying more for feedstuffs, hay, plant-based protein feeds, and especially for corn.
So be aware of what may transpire here as far as feedstuff prices ahead. Jim, you did want to mention, you say something about the trend currently in steer and heifer dressed weights. And those are leaning to the lower side, which is a positive.
Those weights, we've been concerned a little bit in the industry about, are we backing up cattle in the feed yards? And if we look at the reported USDA latest dressed weights, that's clearly not the case. Weights are running above a year ago. For example, in the latest data, steer dressed weights were 10 pounds above last year. But last year we were pulling cattle ahead very aggressively. So these weights are still declining seasonally. We haven't really seen an anomaly in terms of weights spiking higher or not continuing their normal seasonal decline at this time of year. So that implies that we're in pretty good shape. We've not slowed down marketing rates enough that it's had a obvious negative impact. Again, these weights are running above last year, but that's the normal trend, and they're continuing to decline at this time of year, which they're supposed to do, and they are doing, which alleviates some of the concern in that arena.
That leads us to take a look ahead, speaking of currentness in the market, to this Friday's USDA Cattle on Feed report. And your pre-report estimates out of the LMIC for these new numbers. We've seen several months running now of placements in feedlots higher. You say that the trend may turn the other direction this time around.
Well, Eric, as you mentioned, we've had 13 consecutive months of year-over-year increases in placements of animals into feed yards. And so we've had more than a long string of that. And as we look ahead to this Cattle on Feed report, which will be the April 1 count and the placements for the month of March, we see those placements down year over year for the first time in 13 months. I'm thinking that the overall market analyst community will have these placements down 5 to 10% year over year, with maybe even a few with larger year over year declines. We're down about 6% year over year for placements in the month of March. Now, importantly, we're comparing to a very large number of placements a year ago in March, over 2.1 million head, record large number. So we think some of these cattle, especially due to drought conditions in the Southern Plains, came into feed yards a little earlier, but it's been a long time since we've seen a year-over-year decline in placements. Marketing should come in below a year ago, down about 4% also, but we had one less slaughter day. So these marketing rates are slightly above a year ago on a daily basis. Not as good a marketing rate, certainly, as we had a year ago, but I think adequate, not positive, but not clearly negative. That'll leave us an on-feed count about 8% above a year ago. That's a large number to still work through, very much in line with recent months, though, Eric. And so is this a major turning point? We still have, more cattle than a year ago in our beef production system, but a lot of cattle have already been placed into feed yards, and we think this report will start to reflect that. And we've been waiting several months for that to start to be the situation.
So, again, the USDA monthly cattle on feed report covering the numbers as of March will be issued this Friday by the department. We'll be watching for that. In advance of that report, Jim, looking at the trade for this week, can it build upon the momentum established last week?
Well, the meat market will be a clear key, Eric, but again, as we mentioned earlier in the discussion, mid-month is often a time where packers are stepping forward for animals, and they're transitioning away from the program cattle and towards more in the cash marketplace. And another factor that we've had is a very positive basis in terms of wanting to market cattle. In other words, the futures are at a very large discount here in April relative to the cash market. That ought to, especially for hedge cattle, that'll bring cattle into the marketplace as packers step forward. So I think there's a need for packers to buy animals on the cash market. They've kind of stood back from that even last week. And so there's a little bit of potential here. We can at least hold last week's strength and maybe move a little bit higher. Again, at this time of year, a mid-month bit of a rally in the live cattle marketplace is rather typical. And we'll probably see that, maybe this month, maybe next month again. Now, we do not expect prices in April to have the large rally that they did a year ago. There's a lot more cattle on feed and cattle available. But again, this next week may provide an opportunity, especially for people that want to move some hedge cattle and take advantage of that basis situation, Eric.
Very well. Jim, your insight's always appreciated, and we will touch base again in a few weeks. Many thanks to you.
It's been my pleasure, Eric.
That's Jim Robb, the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center and one of the livestock economists in our regular rotation for the weekly cattle market segment here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. We're back now on this Agriculture Today. The leading issues in commodity futures trading were highlighted at a special conference that was held just a little over a week ago in Overland Park. It was sponsored by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Center for Risk Management, Education, and Research here at Kansas State University, a first-of-its-kind gathering. Two of those attending are with us now from K-State Research and Extension Agricultural Economics, Glynn Tonsor and Mykel Taylor. They participated in 2 of the 5 panel discussions that made up this program in large part. Glynn, the aim of this meeting, it was really quite a gathering, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. There was big attendance, and it was a mix of industry, government officials, as well as several academics were in the audience. It was a focus on ag commodity futures. What is the interaction between futures markets and cash markets in many ways, specific topics about that in specific sectors. So whether it was livestock, for example, the panel I was on, or grains or whatever, varied across panels. But it was the first of its kind to where those 3 broad groups, and governmental agencies, the industry, as well as academics got together and in many ways just kind of discussed the current situation, concerns, and there was some potential solutions shared, but it was mainly a State of the Union as it relates to ag commodity futures.
So, Mykel, it was an airing of current issues and topics of high importance to the industry overall then?
Yes, and it was a really good interaction across different groups of people, just a high-energy conference.
And it was rather far-flung in the topics it covered because the futures are quite complex, as all in agriculture know. There were these panel discussions, and we might touch upon the ones that you two participated in. And Glynn, you were actually on the panel for one of those discussions on the design of futures contracts. Now, have we seen a dramatic change in those over the years? Is that what prompted this?
So I would say what prompted it is a recognition that the live cattle cash markets around the country, which most of our listeners are aware of, and the actual CME live cattle contract at times have not moved in the same direction as expected. And moreover, one might be, quote unquote, more volatile than the other. And those kind of observations over time. Has there been changes in the contract over time? Yes, there's been a lot of changes. So the weight specs, the percent choice, the delivery points, there's a lot of those, kind of nitty and gritty details, but they are important nitty gritty details on those contracts that have changed over time. And one of the things we talked about is whether or not, more stuff could change, and we can talk about that if you like. But to synthesize kind of the motivation for this is a recognition that the cash and futures markets, they inform each other, or at least that's my personal opinion, and yet at the same time don't always move in the same direction at the same velocity and so forth.
So was there any resolution to that question of getting those markets to work in concert or at least move in a parallel direction?
Yeah, so this, again, would the disclaimer would be as a Tonsor opinion. I'm not sure there was a solution that was confirmed by any means there. There was a recognition of the challenge and a few potential solutions, or maybe just to ease the situation, maybe is a better way to put it. And I'll highlight one of them for our listeners. One of the things I argued on the panel was that there's more diverse cattle production types than we used to have. Most of our listeners are familiar with CAB branded beef, and there's a lot of things we do different. That's not just all cattle are the same. And to pick on number 2 yellow corn for a moment, that's fairly homogeneous. We don't produce cattle in nearly as homogeneous of a way, yet we have one fairly standardized futures contract. So there's a lot of individual operators around the countryside who might have a quality spec on their cattle that partially aligns with the contract. And that's probably part of why we're seeing some differences in cash and futures movement is they don't align on the exact type of cattle per se. So one of the things that was suggested, Joe Cavanda, who was another panelist, to give him credit here, made the comment about, quote unquote, quality adjusting the cash prices. So adjust them on, or even on your own, not necessarily national market, but your own transactions to get them in line with what they would look like if they match the specs on the board. And that might be a way for us to understand the basis variation, the difference between cash and futures. And I think what Joe was asserting is once we do that, maybe there isn't as much difference between cash and futures as it looks like at the moment. At face value, I agree with that suggestion. Pragmatically implementing it has some challenges that I won't belabor here. But for somebody that knows the type of their cattle, I encourage them to take that suggestion to heart. So that's one potential solution, if you like.
Do you think the dialogue sparked actual interest in moving in that direction then at some point?
There is definitely interest. Whether or not there's going to be an aggregate move by either the industry in tracking those things more, USDA reporting things differently, or CME changing the contract, that's all beyond me to speculate. Those are all potential future adjustments. A little bit back to what both Mykel and I said initially, most of this was just kind of where we're at, clarifying where we're at, and then some brainstorming by folks. And that's very valuable. I don't want to diminish that. But I wouldn't say even this quality adjusted component, it's not in the works today to be implemented by any means. It was just shared, and I'm trying to highlight it as one thing that probably warrants more consideration.
It's on the radar anyway.
Yeah.
Mykel, you were on the panel which took up the role of speculators in the futures markets. And as we know, that can often evolve into a controversial topic at times. But what was the drift of this particular panel?
So the format of the conference was to have an academic present some research and then listen to some industry discussants sort of respond to that research and then open it up for questions from the audience. So Aaron Smith was our academic presenter from the University of California at Davis. And what he presented there was basically some results that said that, yeah, it looks like speculators do, and he specifically said managed money, not the index funds, but managed money, does seem to have some positive correlations with price, which means that when they move, prices move in the same direction. And so what that might mean is that speculators are having some impacts on the market besides just providing liquidity, which was kind of an interesting result to present because I'll agree with you, it's not a resolved issue as to whether or not speculators are good or bad for the markets. I mean, it's great to have their liquidity, but there's still some contention about whether or not they have impacts on the market that might show up in the form of more basis volatility, might be influencing the markets in a way that is not necessarily what people expect. So it was an interesting conversation, and it did end with essentially an agreement to disagree on how speculators are impacting the market. There was other research presented that basically said no, it doesn't look like there was much there. So it was really interesting because we had sort of both sides of the panel talking about the good and the bad of speculators, and I wouldn't say that we came to any kind of a adamant conclusion that they're good or they're bad. I think they have their pros and cons.
But there was value in putting all of that out on the table. So
I think just to help people understand what those pros and cons are of having that kind of money in the market for both the liquidity aspect of it and then what they do for the trading side.
Mykel, you weren't on the panel we'll talk about briefly here, but you were keenly interested in it because you have been engaged here at K-State in this topic of convergence in the markets, and we think about the wheat price convergence issue that welled up here a couple of years ago in the state of Kansas and elsewhere. And this was a panel on troubleshooting convergence by title. It was getting into that issue directly, the lack of convergence? It
was getting into lack of convergence primarily on the wheat contracts, although the corn and soybean contracts were also discussed. It's not an easy topic to summarize in 2 sentences or less, but what it did come down to was a discussion of how the warehouses that would accept wheat on a futures contract, how they're handling storage and whether or not it's profitable for them to accept that wheat for delivery to arbitrage the futures contract against the cash market. And, there was some enlightening information, I think, that it's the storage component of the futures contract that's really causing basis to not converge during the delivery month.
And there's been the attempt to address this in the wheat trade via the variable storage rate. And
yes.
Was there any preliminary evaluation of that within that discussion?
No, it's a little too early, I think, to tell whether or not it's working. It probably give us about a year to be able to see how it's worked out over the course of an entire marketing year, and then we'll be able to tell what's going on there and whether or not it's helping. But there's so many things that affect basis on the wheat side. If we're talking about, rail rates, we could be talking about protein. That's been a big deal this year or this past year as to whether or not our protein levels were high enough to meet the contract. And so there's a lot of things that will drive cash away from futures.
Well, by the sound of it, this 2-day conference was fruitful and got a number of things out there on the table for the industry to consider.
Absolutely. I think it also set the stage for future conferences. I hope that those happen because there was just so much engagement by the attendees and lots of great questions and hopefully even the potential for some good answers to some of these questions. So, I think it really set us up for having more of these conferences going forward, and I hope that happens.
And not only do I think the stage was set well for that, I don't think these are going to be answered in academic silos or even just by the industry or just by the government. I think it's going to take a coalition to tackle some of these things. And I hope the multiple groups that were represented are willing to kind of tackle these things jointly rather than hope another group tackles it.
Well, by the sound of it, a great start to that broad dialogue on all of these matters regarding futures trading and the effects on our commodity markets. Thanks to the both of you for coming over and giving us a quick synopsis of what took place in Overland Park a few days back.
You're welcome.
My pleasure, Eric.
Mykel Taylor and Glynn Tonsor, agricultural economists with K-State Research and Extension. They were among the numerous participants in this joint conference held by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Center for Risk Management, Education, and Research at Kansas State University. We'll be back with more shortly on this Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Northwest Area 4-H Day Camps, which began in 1967 through a partnership with the Dane G. Hansen Foundation in Logan, Kansas, are still going strong today. In fact, Northwest Area 4-H specialist Deryl Waldren says these day camps are now being offered in both the winter and spring throughout the northwest quarter of the state.
This involves the 26 counties in northwest Kansas, plus a couple more counties closer to Salina that are eligible to apply for these day camps. The day camp would be an out-of-school activity. Most people envision it happening in the summertime in a park, but it's really a broader definition. It would be any out-of-school activity with kids, and most times the program would be for 6 to 9-year-olds, maybe 6 to 10-year-olds, and they pick a theme, and then they build a day program around that. So it could be in the summertime, and many of them are, but we also now have a winter application period where day camps can be in the wintertime. The bulk of them would be in May and June for the summertime, because that's when the counties just seem to organize them. There seems to be better results having a day camp soon after school lets out. But then the wintertime ones can run from November 15 till about May 1. They spread those out when there are various needs, or perhaps when school's out of session and there's a need for a day camp on a particular day. The idea is that there's lots of learning going on, lots of fun being had by everybody attending, and about a particular subject matter area.
And these are not just for 4-H members. These are for the community.
Yeah, definitely for the community. And we want counties to advertise them to the community, and our hope is that there are always non-4-H youth who are attending, and our desire is that then they will get involved in the traditional or club 4-H program throughout the rest of the year.
So these are really educational day camps then?
Yeah, I mean, they're through 4-H, they're always built on the foundation of education. K-State Research and Extension 4-H is research-based education. So each county has a different way of doing it. A lot of times the county extension staff involve teen counselors or teen leaders who then plan the theme and help execute it, meaning that they're there to actually teach it and do the activities with the kids. So it's a great way to build teen leadership skills as well as some organizational skills.
How do they come up with the idea for these? Is this something that the community is asking for? That might be one way they do it, or is it just something that the 4-Hers might be interested in offering?
Well, with a rich history of 52 years doing it, I mean, many counties just have a strong history of having a day camp every summer, or now more in the wintertime as schools are out of session and children do need to do different activities, and these winter day camps provide that. So it would be based on a need, and again, working with these teens, they would come up with a particular theme. It might be a Western theme, a luau theme, a Hawaiian, a pioneer theme. I know that a while back, one of the counties did one on pioneer life, what they did when they came to Western Kansas and how they survived and how they ate and did everything. And they built it around that and showed them a soddy, a sod home and all the tools and things that they had to work with in the 1800s and showed kids that it was a lot harder life, and they had to work a lot harder to get the same results because there wasn't the mechanization and the electronics that there are today. So it can just take that theme, and the kids really like that one because I think they made homemade butter and did a few other things and maybe made their own lunch. So a lot of times the kids will make their own lunch at the day camp because that's a good way to get them involved and engaged by making the food that they cook that then they later eat for lunch. The imagination is the only limitation for what the theme could be, and they would build the activities and the education around those themes.
And the hands-on activity has got to be more entertaining, more engaging.
Oh, yeah. These were all built around hands-on activities because that would be the nature of a day camp, to have lots of activities that they're making or doing something, and they would not be there listening to much of a lecture, though that might be a part of it. But then if they had a lecture on pioneer life, then they would, it would be a natural for them to learn how to make homemade butter, which many kids today would never have any idea how to do that in a churn, or you can actually make it in a jar and shake a jar with a partner and make your butter, and then you could put it on your slice of bread and eat it.
These are billed as day camps. Do they sometimes stretch over several days?
Most of them are from like a 9 to 3 and one day, but sometimes in the wintertime they might do a series of 3 or 4 Saturdays over a course of a couple of months where they would have a particular theme or themes and work it as a day camp. It doesn't have to have one exact absolute format for reaching kids on this day camp setting.
You kind of mentioned the fact that they do this year in and year out. These are then sustainable camps and camps that may be offered from year to year?
Yes, I mean, this is a grant application program, so we apply for a grant from the Dane G. Hansen Foundation in Logan, Kansas, which is in Phillips County, and then we redistribute it to those counties in the Northwest area that wish to apply for either a summer or wintertime day camp grant. We also have single counties where they can do just one county at a time, or we do what we call multi-counties, where two or more counties would go together and have a common theme and work together with a variety of counties coming together for this particular subject matter day camp.
Also looking for projects that will have an impact within the community?
Yeah, I guess the overriding idea would be that if kids have a great experience at a day camp, even if they're not in 4-H, I mean, they would be a type of 4-H'er because they're having a 4-H day camp. We would hope that one of the things that might occur is that families would think, we had such a great time here, we're going to look into getting involved in 4-H on a year-round basis in a 4-H club. So that's one of our desires or one of our goals for these programs.
And I know that you like to do follow-up, so there are things that are done after the camps to find out just how successful they are?
We do. The Dane G. Hansen Foundation has a rigorous application process, and we have to do a final report every year, and that is coming up sometime later in April that I have to finish up the report for the 17 program year, and then I'll be applying for a 2018 grant this coming year.
And you mentioned the fact that the counties will be publicizing these day camps, so folks should be looking for that.
Yes, they'll begin to publicize them in April and early May, because a lot of them do get started right after school gets out in late May. And so folks should contact their local extension office to see when their county will be offering a single or multi-county day camp this summer. And if folks have more questions, they could contact me, Deryl Waldren, the 4-H specialist out here in Northwest Kansas and the Northwest Research Extension Center in Colby, and my phone number is 785-462-6281, and my email is dwaldren@ksu.edu, and that would be DWALDREN@ksu.edu.
That's Northwest Area 4-H Specialist Deryl Waldren. Again, information about Northwest Area 4-H day camps is available at all Northwest County and District Extension offices or by contacting Deryl directly. His contact information can be found online at kansas4h.org under the About tab. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.